Welcome to Module 3. Here we shift the gears from understanding HEPGA to using it. In the previous module, we explored the different components of the framework, including macro, meso, and micro policy and governance, culture, and shadow policy. The question now becomes, how can we use HEPGA to analyze educational issues and challenges? Let's begin with a simple observation. When educational problems emerge, we often focus on a single explanation. For example, if student achievement is declining, some people may blame policy, others may focus on schools, teachers, students, culture, or leadership. But we have learned that educational issues are rarely the result of a single factor. Student achievement can be influenced by policy decisions, organizational structures, everyday practices, cultural expectations, or informal processes operating beneath the surface. The challenge is that we often focus on the explanation that is most visible to us. A teacher may focus on classroom practice. A principal may focus on organizational decisions. A policymaker may focus on legislation or accountability measures. HEPGA helps us move beyond these narrow explanations. Rather than asking what is the cause, HEPGA encourages us to ask what factors are interacting to produce this outcome. This shift helps us develop a more holistic understanding of educational issues. As we move through this module, we will learn how to use HEPGA as a practical analytical tool for examining challenges, policies, programs, and organizational issues in our own context. It is time to pause and reflect. You can stop the video after the instructions and think about a challenge in your educational context. How is that challenge usually explained? Who or what tends to receive the blame or credit? Now consider the possibility that other influences may also be shaping the issue. What explanations might be missing? You can pause the video and discuss. In the previous slide, we discussed why educational issues often require more than a single explanation. HEPGA helps us address this challenge by providing an analytical lens through which we can examine educational issues more systematically. Think of HEPGA as a set of questions rather than a set of answers. The framework does not tell us what to think. It helps us decide where to look and what questions to ask. As shown on the slide, HEPGA encourages us to examine an issue through 5 interconnected dimensions. At the macro level, we ask, what policies, regulations, or system-level priorities are influencing the issue? At the meso level, we ask, what organizational structures, leadership decisions, or institutional processes are shaping outcomes? At the micro level, we ask, what is happening in everyday practice? How are educators, students, and other actors experiencing or responding to the issue? HEPGA also reminds us to look beyond formal structures. We ask, what cultural assumptions, values, or norms are influencing decisions? And what informal practices, relationships, or unwritten rules may be operating in the background? These questions help us move beyond narrow explanations and develop a richer understanding of educational issues. Rather than focusing on only one factor, we begin to see how multiple influences interact to shape the outcomes. It's time to pause and reflect. When you encounter a challenge in your educational context, which of these questions do you tend to ask first? Do you focus primarily on policy, organizational structures, classroom practice, or do you also consider culture and informal influences? Which of these dimensions do you think you overlook most often? You can pause the video and discuss. When you finish, you can continue to the next slide. Now that we have introduced HEPGA, we can begin using it. The first step in any HEPGA analysis is to map the issue. Before explaining a problem or proposing solutions, we first need to understand where the issue exists within the educational system. Many educational challenges are immediately associated with a particular level. For example, we might think of student absenteeism as a classroom issue, teacher workload as a school issue, or curriculum reform as a policy issue. But HEPGA encourages us to resist jumping to conclusions too quickly. Instead, we begin asking a simple question: what is the issue? Once we identify the issue, we can then ask who is affected and which levels of the system appear to be involved. As shown on the slide, HEPGA encourages us to examine the issue across macro, meso, and micro levels. At this stage, we're not trying to determine causes or assign responsibility. We're simply mapping where the issue exists and where it may be influenced. For example, consider teacher workload. At the micro level, teachers experience the workload directly. At the meso level, school principals, schedules, and organizational expectations may shape that experience. At the macro level, accountability systems, reporting requirements, or policy reforms may also contribute. By mapping the issue first, we avoid oversimplifying complex educational challenges. We begin to see that most issues extend across multiple levels rather than existing in only one place. It's time to pause and reflect. You can choose one issue from your own educational context. It can be related to student learning, inclusion, staffing, well-being, technology, attendance, assessment, or any other area that affects your work. You can ask yourself, which levels of the system appear to be involved? Is this only a micro-level issue, or do macro and meso influences also play a role? You can pause the video and discuss. When you finish, you can continue to the next slide. Once we have mapped an issue across the educational system, the next step in HEPGA is to identify the influences shaping that issue. This is where HEPGA begins to move beyond description and toward analysis. At this stage, we ask a simple but important question: what influences this issue? Rather than assuming a simple cause, HEPGA encourages us to examine multiple influences simultaneously. We begin at the macro level. Are there policies, regulations, funding decisions, accountability measures, or broader political priorities influencing the issue? Next, we examine the meso level. How are organizational structures, leadership decisions, resource allocation, or institutional practices shaping what is happening? We then consider the micro level. What is occurring in everyday practice? How are educators, students, families, or other actors experiencing and responding to the issue? HEPGA also encourages us to look beyond formal structures, which means what cultural values, assumptions, or norms might be influencing decisions and behaviors, and what informal practices, relationships, or unwritten rules might be operating beneath the surface. One of the strengths of HEPGA is that it helps us identify influences that are often overlooked. Some influences are highly visible, such as policies or organizational procedures. Others may be less visible, such as culture, informal networks, or shadow policies. But all of these can shape outcomes. The goal is not simply to create a long list of influences. The goal is to develop a richer understanding of the forces acting on the issue before drawing conclusions or proposing solutions. It's time to pause and reflect. You can return to the issue you identified in the previous slide. What influences are most visible? Which influences are discussed most often? And then now consider what might be hidden. Are there cultural assumptions, informal practices, or shadow policies that may also be shaping the issue? You can pause the video and discuss. When you've finished, you can move to the next slide. We have now mapped the issue and identified the influences shaping it. The final step is to examine how these influences interact. This is where HEPGA becomes especially powerful as an analytical framework. Many analyses stop after identifying factors. For example, we might conclude that a policy is causing a problem or that organizational structures are creating barriers. But HEPGA encourages us to go one step further. Instead of focusing on individual factors, we examine the relationships between them. Educational outcomes rarely emerge from a single influence. They're usually produced through interactions among policies, organizations, everyday practices, culture, and informal processes. For example, a policy may establish new expectation. An organization may interpret that expectation in a particular way. Educators may then adapt their practices in response. At the same time, cultural norms and informal practices may support, modify, or even resist the intended change. This means that educational outcomes are often the result of multiple influences working together. Some influences may reinforce one another, others may create tensions, contradictions, or unintended consequences. When using HEPGA, we therefore look for patterns of interaction. How do policies influence organizational decisions? How do organizational decisions shape everyday practice? How do cultural norms support or resist change? And how do informal practices influence what actually happens in practice? These questions help us move beyond simple explanations and toward a deeper understanding of how educational systems operate. It's time to pause and reflect. You can return to the issue you've been examining. Think about the influences you identified in the previous slide. How might those influences be interacting with one another? Do some reinforce each other? Do some create tensions or contradictions? What patterns do you notice? You can pause the video and discuss. Once you finish, you can move to the next slide. In this video, we've learned that HEPGA is not simply a framework for describing educational systems. It's a practical tool that helps us understand complex issues more systematically. The process begins by mapping the issue. Rather than assuming where a problem exists, we identify the issue, determine who is affected, and examine which levels of the educational system are involved. Next, we identify the influences shaping the issue. We look across macro, meso, and micro levels while also paying attention to culture and shadow policy. This helps us recognize both visible and hidden influences that may be affecting outcomes. Finally, we analyze interactions. Instead of treating influences as separate factors, we examine how they work together. We ask how policies, organizations, practices, culture, and informal processes interact to produce particular outcomes. Collectively, these three steps help us move beyond simple explanations. Most importantly, HEPGA encourages us to think critically about complexity. Educational challenges are rarely caused by one policy, one leader, or one classroom practice. They emerge through interactions across multiple levels and contexts. It's time to pause and reflect. You can think about an issue, challenge, or opportunity in your educational context. How might using the HEPGA lens change the way you investigate that issue? What might you notice now that you may have overlooked before? And how might a system's perspective lead to different solutions or decisions? You can pause the video and discuss. When you finish, you can stop watching this video. In the next video, we will apply HEPGA to a real educational case and walk through the analytical process step by step.